Okay.
All right, we are recording. I've got Bob Dobbs here, currently a DJ for a show called Payday on Achieve Radio. But formerly, you've been a VJ journalist going back to the 80s into the conspiracy realm. Um, you were very close at one point with Walter Boert, which is kind of how we connected because Boert wrote Operation Mind Control, which is one of the seminal books into the landscape of MK Ultra and the overall, government programs to mess with your minds, people. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot of places to go with it. I guess let's just start with because I know Boert was you guys had a certain close relationship, and you were doing his biography at one point, like just in terms of giving people analysis of who this guy was and how credible he was. So let's start with that. What made you connect with Boert in particular amongst all the various personalities that were out there exposing this mind control stuff?
Well, I became the East Village Other in '66, about a year into its publication. I think it started in '65 in the East Village in New York City. And so I read it religiously every week for years. And then he disappeared off the masthead in late '67, early '68. And I didn't know what happened to him, but he wrote an article about a year later. He put one more article in, which if I remember, he said, what's going to happen is they're going to have to put a broadcast booth in the middle of the town or city or, where society is, so people can come on and mouth off and broadcast out into the street. So he predicted the internet in a way, or Web 2.0. So I thought he must know about McLuhan. So who I was studying and got to know, and then I eventually became McLuhan's archivist in his last years. But so I visited New York City in 1970 and met Dean Latimer and Lita Lescu, all the stalwarts of the East Village Other. But Walter, nobody knew what had happened to him. He really disconnected from the East Village Other. So, or they didn't want to talk about him for some reason. So he was always in the back of my mind until November '79. And McLuhan had his stroke in September 26, '79. So he wasn't doing his Monday night open to the public seminars, but his son was. So at the end of November '79, a bunch of Scientologists came into the meeting at the end and handed out little pamphlets about some talk. And I look at it, it says, Walter Boert is going to speak in Toronto on Operation Mind Control. Let me see, which I hadn't read yet. So I made sure to go to the speech, which was about a week later, December 3rd or something. It was a Sunday afternoon. And as soon as I saw him, very handsome, imposing, tall guy, he was talking with people before he spoke. So I went up and introduced myself. And I said the right words, East Village Other. He knew that I wasn't a newbie. He knew I knew his history. So he said, hey, we got to talk after. So we arranged for that. Then I watched his slideshow, which was really great. A summary of his book, Operation Mind Control. And then he stayed in Toronto for a week. So we hung out all the time. But the next day, on Monday, when I found out that he'd been looking for McLuhan himself since 1968, when he left the East Village Other, he figured Marshall McLuhan had a son. And so he was wondering where the son was, but he didn't do much research. You could have found out, you could have called McLuhan's office in Toronto, but he just had this fantasy he'd like to do something with McLuhan's son, because he probably thought McLuhan was unapproachable. So that didn't happen. And then Tim Leary offered Peggy Hitchcock to him in exchange for the East Village Other. Now, Leary never got the East Village Other, but Walter hooked up with Peggy, and then they got married in a year or so out in Tucson area. So we're talking this in December '79, and I said, well, McLuhan's got his seminars going. He's not there, but his son is. He says, well, let's go. So we went, and I talked to a couple of people, introduced Walter, but not to Eric. He was busy. Eric did his talk, which was based on subliminal seduction, the Wilson key book about advertising having embeds in it. Came out about 73 or so. And this is December 79. So he was giving this talk for an hour and a half or so. And then somebody said, hey, we have an interesting person here. Can we hear from him? We've got your theme. We understand what you're showing us. But what about this guy that Bob brought in? And they didn't know anything about Walter, but they just knew, you know, he was pretty charismatic looking. So Walter got up. Eric said, okay. So Walter get up and start talking about Operation Mind Control. Blew everybody's mind. This is an academic situation, right? And nobody was thinking that way at the University of Toronto. And so the important point is that there was no more meetings ever again. Eric stopped. That was the last one. And then his father died a year later, December 1980. And then a couple of his friends started something ad hoc in different places, but the great public seminars were over. So Walter closed the McLuhan world with the, I would call the top down of media massage, bureaucratic control of minds, or whatever MK Ultra was, as opposed to collective media effects that McLuhan became famous for.
Right.
So Walter was the guy to end the whole scene.
Well, so interesting question here. So Peggy Mellon was related to William Hitchcock, Mellon Hitchcock, right? They're the Mellon Hitchcock family and William Hitchcock was known for being this sort of like LSD provider, right? Part of this whole like acid stuff that a lot of people say was really intelligence disseminating LSD for experimental purposes, right? Tim Leary got his first LSD from the CIA, right? So what did Board understand about his own relationship with Peggy and that whole family? He's trying to essentially expose the mind control. Did he see how it was actually effectively working through his own relationship, or not through his relationship, but through, you know, his wife Peggy at the time?
Yeah, what happened is that Walter had, and I've written about it, he had this, somebody gave him some drugs he thought was LSD. He ended up on LSD on this trip for 4 months in the fall of '66, for a long time. And he was stuck in it. So that made him think, oh, there's drugs out there that are used as weapons or something, you know, like he figured somebody didn't like the East Village other and what he represented, because he was quite a powerful figure at that point, leader of the underground press. So he probably started to wonder about the drug thing, the dark side of it, you could say. And he told me when he married Peggy, which was in '69, he had gone to the clan annual meeting. And, you know, like maybe there's 5 brothers, like 100 people. When I met Peggy later, I saw a photograph of one of these meetings, and there's 100 people there. And Walter said he was there. And of course, they knew he was becoming part of the family. So the lawyer, or one of the lawyers, came up to him, knowing who Walter was, said, so this would be the fall of '68. We are going to put Nixon in the White House, and we're going to create a depression and make it a privilege to have a job. That was said to Walter, right as he's beginning. So for some reason, Walter didn't leave, or he still, I think he was like, I'm infiltrating, he probably thought, because he told me that he went from being one of the first hippies to being the first yuppie. He considered himself the first yuppie because he started, you know, what the yuppies did. They started to get materialistic or try to get money. So he was living in that environment. And so he had a very up and down relationship with the Mellons, Hitchcock. What's very interesting is Peggy's father was a all-American guy in World War II. Peggy was born in 1933, and he put the Rolls-Royce engine in a plane. So that helped American pilots during the war. But Peggy says he knew her father knew David Sarnoff. So he was experimenting with television, probably stole it from what's that guy, Farnsworth, Philo Farnsworth. And though I'm not sure, I don't want to be held to that, but he had the early TV. And so Peggy as a kid was a subject to the experiment of what happens when the house has a television. They had one of the first TVs in the '40s during the war and after. Meanwhile, her father was testing out the plane, and it was successful, but one day he crashed and died. So she lost her father, but he was a legend because he had done some neat things as an all-around New York man about town, and he was an inventor. So that was her background in relation to her family. And then she married a European French race car driver, but he died in a crash. And then she married some guy in New York. And so she was very involved with social life. And then in the late 70s, when Walter was on tour, sponsored by Scientology, because they hated psychiatry and they saw his Operation Mind Control as against psychiatry, he got a call from his daughters at one point. He might have been in Europe. And that's when he hung out with Fletcher Prouty, the guy that in JFK, Sutherland plays the mystery character, the guy who knows more. And so the daughter says, there's a strange man in our house. Come home. So he eventually gets home, and the CIA or somebody had sent a guy in who seduced Peggy, and Peggy was lost to that. And Walter was shocked by all that, but it made him more suspicious of what's going on here. And he became suspect of what he called Richcraft. Ever seen that book title, Richcraft?
That's a great title. I got to look it up.
Well, it doesn't exist. He was writing it, and he was writing about his understanding of rich people and the family, the Mellon Hitchcock family, how much they were vulnerable to MK Ultra stuff. It just came with the territory. Now, I'm not saying Peggy was a victim of MK Ultra. I'm just telling you honestly what Walter wondered about. No, they got divorced in the late 70s. So Walter was on his own, and then he married another woman, but he became more, more sophisticated about what was happening. It wasn't some distance project. And one thing, if somebody doesn't believe Operation Mind Control, well, there's a chapter, Portrait of an Assassin. I visited Walter a few months after I met him, and that was in April 1980 up in Aspen, Colorado. He gave me, and I listened to the tape, the interview with the assassin. Okay. And it was in a restaurant with a lot of cooking utensils crashing in the background, but it wasn't made up. What's actually in the book is on a recording. So there really was this guy saying what that chapter, which is the important chapter, what Walter was saying, unless the guy, the assassin, was making it all up himself for some reason. But that was a peak experience in his research and finding that guy. And then as he just got more suspicious. In other words, he started to notice that we could call it the Kathy O'Brien syndrome of people being an MK Ultra and being sex slaves and things like that. That came out like 10 years later. He was on to that could be a possibility before he heard of any people because of certain things he witnessed in the Mellon clan, his social involvement with them. It's interesting that the lawyer had no compunction about telling Walter what they're going to do. Does that mean that, okay, Walter, you tell anybody, you're a journalist, we'll just kill you? What kind of arrogance is that? Where you tell you're going to make a conspiracy that's going to happen and did happen, in terms of.
That's usually what the argument is, I think. It's the point is that they use either, you tell anybody, we know we can't trust you, right? That's kind of oftentimes how they do stuff, right? So they use it like, okay, we're going to give you if you go out there and start blabbing about it, now we know you can't be trusted. Or, they go, they turn around and say, I never said that. This person's crazy, right? Or how can he prove it? Especially as a journalist, as you know, it's difficult because if you have someone's deep throat, I mean, come on, this is not how things work. You have to get, verification, documentation, multiple sources, right? You can't just have one person at a party told me they're going to put Nixon in. Yeah, right. How does that work? It could have been.
Yeah. So did you just ask me? You blipped out. Did you end with a question? Or you just
No,
think
actually, so I was going to ask you. So he essentially understood that this mind control was working at different levels as far as sexuality is concerned. Sexualization of women, using women as essentially using them for sexual purposes or manipulating them through sex. There's the assassins, mind controlled assassins, programming of the psyche. How did he see it when he was interested in McLuhan's work, though? How did he see it being broadcast to the masses? How did he see mind control basically becoming operational through the television, through the media, right? Through Mockingbird, the CIA purchasing of media. Like, how did he see it essentially?
Well, that was the debate. As he learned, I was a very good explainer of McLuhan, and it's amazing. It's pretty simple now to understand McLuhan, but nobody understood him back then in the 60s and 70s, it seemed. So because I could explain it, Walter got a lot of new insights that were latent in him. He kind of noticed it as a journalist running a paper, but he really got some eurekas. So we had endless dialogues. And so I was always saying the MK Ultra is designed to control people's minds or put out ideas as propaganda, like you got to remain an American capitalist or something. But as the media expanded with cable TV in the 70s and 80s, you can't control people's minds anymore. It's not just 3 stations. So actually, I said they gave up on MK Ultra in the 60s in terms of the initial military propaganda meaning of it that the early guys thought they were going to do because you couldn't control society with ideas or information anymore because the decentralization of television and cable TV, then the beginning of computers, that led to a whole new thing. So Walter, when he would get interviewed later, he'd always go into the history of MK Ultra that everybody was interested in, and probably the interviewer knew a bit about it. So he developed that. But then at the end of the interview, he'd go, we haven't got time to go into it, but the more important guy is Marshall McLuhan. And there's a whole different way to look at MK Ultra. And the interviewer go, oh, well, okay, well, we got to end now. Okay, bye. So he always dropped McLuhan on them when they didn't have a chance to explore it. And so he was maybe asking to be invited back to explain it. But I never saw him in any recorded interviews ever explain it. But we had this ongoing debate. And if you look at that video of me and him up in he and Peggy's cabin in Paradise, Arizona, it's a funny thing made in September 1990, where you'll see us run through our debate in a humorous way, our positions. So McLuhan was what he was getting more interested in, the vaster effects of media. And it was changing the traditional psychological control. And actually, this new documentary by Adam Curtis, have you seen it? Can't Get You Out of My Head?
Can't Get You Out of My Head. I have not seen it yet. I've been told to see it.
Okay, yeah, well, they have this guy, a psychologist, Carnahan or something. He was pretty innovative in the 60s, 70s, and he eventually got a Nobel Prize like 30 years later. Well, he says in the last episode of the documentary that studies came out that proved you can't control people's minds. It's bullshit. The whole Skinner psychology stuff of the first 80 years of the 20th century was disproven. And he had quite an identity crisis over this. It just disproved everything he was doing. But it supported my idea that I've been saying on the radio for years that the new media mix, which I call the Android meme, is not talking to people. It's computer parts talking to themselves, and that's the economy and ecology. And people are left in the lurch, almost obsolete, at least their physical bodies and physical minds, because we have the discarnate bodies that have been added to us by these media. So I thought he was proving my point that the media doesn't influence people anymore in that old-fashioned George Orwell type of brainwashing. Now, I would explain it differently than Curtis, but he did reveal there were studies showing that that wasn't happening. Now, those studies may be happening and showing that because people are different, and they were programmable 50 years before in a simpler media environment. So there's a lot of questions that come out of that. But that's the big thing. You got to notice that that's a breakthrough, and that causes Curtis to get confused about where the hell are we going. You know, we can't if we're convincing everybody to be an individual, then you can't do that to them. So what's happening to people? What is making them act in tribes or not in tribes? So there's a bit of doubt and questioning in his own long thesis that he's done, Century of the Self, that these new studies exposed. So that's why a lot of people don't
What
like
does that
it.
mean exactly, that you can't control a person's mind? Because we actually have seen hypnosis is very effective. Now, the argument I know underlying hypnosis has always been the person has to, at some level, to do something, right? You cannot make someone kill if they don't have some level of willingness, or, you know, basically there's some fundamental basis of them being able to do that action, right? Then you can latch onto it and
That's
hypnotize.
Walter Bowart's breakthrough.
Same with
That's Bowart's thesis, is that you can make someone violate their conscience and values. That's what he discovered in Operation Mind Control. Are you aware of that? Did I hear you right? That you're saying?
Well, what I'm getting at is, you can go against, let's say, one's own conscience is different. I'm saying let's say there's some part of us, right? There's some dark side within us, right? That we can essentially, that's where I understand hypnosis is concerned. We can manipulate. Hypnosis is very, you know, is very tangible in that regard of, there has to be some willingness on the part, some, like, even if it's, hey, you know, I have guilt around this. Oftentimes when it comes to sex, right? You have guilt around it. If you hypnotize the person or you put them in a state of altered state, what do? They have sex, because it's not that they can't fathom having sex. It's just that it's something that they maybe have guilt around, that you're basically bypassing those, you know, those barriers, right? So when it comes to
murder too.
I'm trying to understand well, exactly. When it comes to murder, it's similar situations where you see, obviously it's not the same as sex. It's more profound. But the point is, what I'm trying to understand is, you're saying that the new psychology is saying that you can't mind control someone, but again, we've seen a history of mind control. So I'm not clear on what they mean by that.
Okay, well, I haven't read, I just saw this 2 weeks ago, so I don't know the studies. I never read them, but he quoted them. So he said it was a phenomenon in psychology, but using McLuhan, and this is what fascinated Walter, is that the larger conditioning of people by the tactile qualities of black and white TV in the 50s brought in rock and roll, beehive hairdos, surfing, all kinds of phenomenon that people wouldn't do before, but they got the notion because the media form of black and white cathode ray tube beaming into them made them have new desires, new preferences. So you're mind controlling people on the level of fashions of behavior. And that, since you don't know what your new technology is going to do, you can't say, we're going to get everybody wearing beehive hairdos. You wait to see what everybody agrees to do. And then you say, well, there it is. There's a brainwashing, or a body senses brainwashing. McLuhan emphasizes the senses. So it's a broader level. And in the long run, you today can't get people to stay on point or to have an idea, because in social media, most time you're performing and you're being, contrarian, just to make an exciting form or something. You know, people play with knowledge, they play with opinions, and they aren't trying to be a conformist. But there is subplots, subcultures of conformity, but there's no mass level that you get everybody on the same place. Basically, that's why you couldn't get anybody to go to war the last 30 years, other than just a imposed situation and force people to go to a war.
I think it's as simple as saying what Lincoln said. You can fool some of the people all the time. You can fool most of the people some of the time, but you cannot fool all the people all the time. It's that simple when it comes to mind control of complete populations. No, unless you completely bypass and do like Jose Delgado was talking about, which was some kind of electric implant right into the brain itself to essentially biohack the individual, right? To essentially put you into a little Borg or hive mind, right?
And that would be a new level. That's a new kind of technology that could get back to, controlling people. But you can't get people to agree to wear masks. You can't get them to agree on the vaccination. There's too much decentralization. And a matter of fact, generally 70% of Americans don't vote. They don't give a damn about politics. It doesn't, they live in so many other environments. What has a bunch of bureaucrats in Washington got to do with anybody? And many people have been forced to live illegally in many different ways, and maybe violate their high school conditioning. They wouldn't think they'd be a criminal, but the economy's been so bad since the 80s for a lot of people, they had to go into crime to survive. And they're not following Christian values or that level of social morality anymore. And so there's a huge cynicism and indifference. And you could say that's the general effect of an environment of too much information. So everybody ends up going, whatever, it's just too much. So the authorities, Big Brother did not foresee that, as far as I know.
So let's talk about McLuhan for a second. What was, because you mentioned that Bort would always bring up McLuhan at the end, but what was the point that he was trying to make about McLuhan?
That my point, he realized that there were larger mind control effects, body control, sociological controls, as well as a decentralization that undermined it all. So he got interested in the late 80s, early 90s in the UFO sightings and field. And he said he went around studying it and participating in conferences, but after a while, he realized there were certain figures that seemed to be military background who wanted to create the meme that everybody be afraid of these UFOs, are going to invade us. They're the new terrorists, the new communists. And they put a whole negative spin on it. But there were a lot of people in the UFO community who were suspicious of that kind of conditioning. They didn't fall for the authority military guys. And they said, no, I'm having an optimistic view. The contact will be great. And Walter was on that level too. So they couldn't control the effort by the military or whoever to control the meme of the UFO invasion, landing, or contact could not be controlled. It's an example. And so that made Walter look to the uncontrolled factors that were coming in. It wasn't as simple as the 50s, 60s, where people were really brainwashed, but it was a smaller, simpler media environment. So that's why in the end, he said to me, I should have written fiction, Bob. He regretted going to nonfiction because it led to a lot of problems in his family. And he was banned. He could not get anywhere to be published because he had the stigma of being a troublemaker very early. And they probably put out Markov, or whatever the guy's name who did In Search of the Manchurian Candidate. They put that book out to cover up Walter, to cover up the more serious points that Walter was making. Because Walter was a very good writer. And anybody who read Operation Mind Control, they were affected by it. It just went beyond what they thought humans would be, especially on the idea that you could be hypnotized to kill people. People thought that they had something in themselves, a soul, a conscience that would stop any kind of manipulation finally. And to realize you couldn't, that was dangerous. Now, if that was the final thing they did, then that only lasted, let's say, till the mid-70s, because after that, the multimedia explosion, what McLuhan called the global theater and the global membrane, made things incredibly free. And you could improvise your lives. You could work a little bit and then take off and go somewhere else or deal with drugs or so many different things, because basically community was not there anymore. There was too many people for anybody to monitor you. You didn't go to church. You didn't have the controls of a smaller community, which is early part of the 20th century. It's we're all on our own for the last 40, 50 years.
Yeah,
and that's the way people live socially.
Well, this is the Aquarian age. The Aquarian age asks us to take more sovereignty, more self-responsibility, and to stand in our individuality and recognize, the power that's fit in Walter's understanding. I saw some of your conversations about the Botians, and I wasn't familiar with that race of aliens, so I wanted to understand more of what his interpretation of the abduction phenomenon looked like.
Okay, so it's Bootians, and it's based on the constellation Bootes, which is spelled Bootes, and there's a 2 or umlaut, German word, over one of the O's. So you might pronounce it Buatis. I just say Bootians, but it's the 7-star constellation with the one that begins with R. I can't remember the main star that everybody knows. It's one of the 7 stars in the constellation. It begins with A. Anyway, so that's now, why pick that one? Well, apparently it's the closest constellation to us. And the civilization in the Boodians, and this is based on esoteric sources of information, the Boodians, they're assigned us to bring us into the space age. They're our co-guardians or babysitters because they're the closest. Also, they realized way back in their history that they came from Earth, that they evolved out of Earth and then took off and forgot where they were coming from. And, millions of years later, rediscovered this planet and started watching the development of the lemur, L-E-M-U-R, and how it seemed to be flexible and survived the whatever wiped out the dinosaurs. And they followed the evolution of the lemur to apes. And then you have the Neanderthal apes. So the Boodians took another strain of ape and they altered the wrist and the jaw. Altering the wrist allowed them to be more flexible and then move towards making tools or a little more easier, more ambidextrous way to use their hands. And they altered the jaw, which changed the digestive juices in the mouth, or the juices in the jaw muscle, and that created a subconscious. That's where we became a human, where a subconscious was created. And so the Cro-Magnon guys who got altered, they survived, and the Neanderthals died out. So we came from the Cro-Magnon through an alteration by the Boodians. So because they were monitoring us, helping our evolution, that's where we got, and they're the ones who are going to make the official contact with us at an appropriate time. Now, I have a bunch of stories. I used to consult a medium, Michael Blake Reed. He channeled the Evergreens. And a very interesting point about Michael Blake Reed is that the CIA or the State Department would come to him once a year. And because his wife was American, Michael was Canadian, they could impose on his wife that this is confidential state information and you can't record this. All sessions with the Evergreens were recorded except for the government ones. So there was no evidence they did this, but they did it for years. And in 1995, 97, that book about Stanford and Hal Puthoff and those guys doing remote viewing at Stanford, that was the cover story to say, oh, that's what the CIA was interested in, when really they were using the Evergreens. So he kept it secret by emphasizing Stanford and not Michael Blake Reed. So Michael Blake Reed was an incredible medium. And so a lot of the details I'm talking about, I got from Michael Blake Reed. And so I'm giving you how the Boodians fit in to our history according to the Evergreens.
What are the Evergreens?
They were 6,500 to 7,000 entities that Michael Blake Reed channeled. That's what attracted me to Michael. He started in 74. He went 30 years to 2004. He did 11,000 sessions in 19 countries. The book, what's the book in 93, where the guy would hand out, it was a big popular book. The author would get a recording, and he gets 10 recordings, and there's something document, I don't know, I can't remember. Anyways, the plot was that you get the 10 recordings and then you'd be enlightened and you'd learn a lot from it. Well, it was actually based on Michael and his wife taking a group of people to Peru in 1984, and they went around to all the Nazca and all the ET sites and different things and mystery artifacts in Peru, and had sessions by the Evergreens explaining what they really were. And you could buy that series. But the president of Peru got very involved with this. Don't remember if he was a Japanese president or not. You have to check 84. But the woman who guided it and was interested in this was a high government position. So the tape spread through Peru, or elites, and eventually the author of this book I'm trying to remember heard about this tape phenomenon and made the book, The Celestine Prophecy. Do you know that book?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, that was based on people or the author finding out about people listening to these evergreen sessions. So that's an interesting cultural point about the evergreens.
So Walter, I mean, Walter
So
believed
Walter
this.
heard about all this stuff. I
Huh?
always kept Walter up on all this stuff. You know
Sure,
what I
but
mean?
Walter was interested in the Bootian idea, but he was also interested in the abduction phenomenon, and also how some of it was being manipulated by military. Some of it was not actual extra dimensional beings. So some of it was actually some kind of military or some kind of
Right. No,
program.
that happened. What I would do with the evergreens, I would ask them about these particular cases, like Barney and Betty Hill. Totally true, says the evergreens. Then the fake abductees, then the manipulated abductees. There was a whole range of things. And so if whatever case came up, I could ask the evergreens, is this real, bona fide, or a joke? So I was always updating Walter on what I did. So Walter and I engaged in a lot of research through the evergreens. I could afford them. They were $500 for an hour, and Walter didn't have the money to do that. So I'd pay for it. I'd get the questions, then talk to Walter about it. So he never got a chance to write about that. I don't think he ever said in his talks what he was using, but his way of referring to our dialogue was to say McLuhan's very important. And the second edition of Operation Mind Control, this big thing that he used to make a copy. Each one, he'd have to publish it himself, make a copy and send it out, you know? And there's a whole section that he ends with me where he quotes McLuhan saying, the big discoveries, and a lot of people know this quote now, the big discoveries are protected by public incredulity, while the puny secrets is what everybody finds out about, the puny secrets. But the big ones, are protected by public incredulity. So he ended his book with that. Now I was looking, I got someone who had a copy, and I got them to look it up, and they couldn't find my part at the end of the book. So it might've been deleted in later editions, but he did acknowledge me. And you've heard my recordings. We talk about it, I think, maybe you haven't heard all of them, but a lot of this stuff is said in our personal phone calls.
So just curious if you were asking the evergreens questions in the Bootians, because I haven't necessarily heard that come up in various, various witness testimony of their own experiences, contactees, whatnot, but did they refer all to the influence of like ways and how they were manipulating essentially the experience? What did the Bootians explain about the dark side that was essentially what the Gnostics called archons, right, feeding on humanity?
You blurted, you burbled, so I didn't hear the middle part. Could you quickly say your point again?
Yeah, I said, what did the evergreens tell you about the dark side, essentially, of controlling humanity? What the Gnostics called archons, reptilian, draconian, reptilian, grays, these influences, so-called Anunnaki intrusions into the human experience.
They didn't talk about that. They talked about the actual oligarchy. And I found out a lot about who killed Kennedy. You name all the conspiracies. I had many sessions. I had 64 sessions over 1980 to over 24-year period. And there was this show in Tucson where Walter was living called UFO AZ with Ted Lohman. And he had a good cable show, and he had everybody of notoriety who all end up on Art Bell later on his TV show. So I was in New York City. I'd watch a show every week, find out whoever he had is on, whatever quote nut he had on about their story, and then I'd write it out and I'd ask the evergreens. So I have a great inventory of every possible wrinkle. But basically, if I wanted to check out oligarchy, LaRouche was pretty good at finding obscure names. He called them the Fondi, Italian families, and trace their families back 2,000 years. All that was confirmed by the evergreens. And I eventually found out what happened. How did AIDS happen? That was in September 88. Basically, Fort Detrick people were in Africa, and they used the smallpox program. They infiltrated it in 76, 77 or so to inject people with what they called a viral debilitant. And you can see a reference to this in the book, A Higher Form of Killing, which Frank Zappa's biography ends with that book. He recommends it, and that was based on me giving him the information. That book came out in about 1982, but it quotes the Senate hearing where a guy in 1970 proposes that, well, war is obsolete. We got to find out another way to take over our enemy. So they said, you put a disease, a program, 3-week-old disease where the population all falls down and can't move. You come in and take over, then the disease mutates and becomes benign, the people get well, and then they work for you. That was this guy's proposal, and you can read it in Higher Form of Killing.
Sounds like COVID. It sounds like COVID. It sounds like the COVID strategy.
Yeah, you're right. So I knew of that. So no, I didn't know of that. What happened is that I asked the Evergreens, what the hell is with AIDS? What's happening? And they said, well, it's a viral debilitant. And they explained everything I said to you, and that document is accurate. That's what they did. And so they had it in, they put it in the smallpox thing, but the virus mutated violently, more violently than they thought, and it went 29 years. So they fucked up the experiment or the probe with it. And so humanity was stuck with it from 1980 on. And they predicted, the Evergreen said, in about 29 or 30 years, it'll be like you got a 24-hour cold. It'll gradually get weak. And basically it has gotten weaker. I don't know exactly what they're doing. I mean, some people say we've got a treatment for it. Others might say it isn't. But the point is it did get weaker. And that's what they predicted. So it was a viral debilitant programmed to be, just work intensely for 3 weeks and then fade out. Well, they screwed it up and it went 29 years of affecting. So, but the point is, that's the kind of stuff I could find out from the Evergreens. Very different from anybody else's statements. And so I knew a lot about Audubon Boswing, not Audubon Boswing. He actually lived in California in Santa Cruz there, Santa Barbara. But Otto von Habsburg, the royal family, was Lady Di murdered? Did OJ kill Nicole? All these things I'd go through. And then I put them on the radio.
Can you give us a few highlights then?
Well, OJ did kill Nicole.
By himself?
Yes, by himself. There is the theory, like Dave Emery would say, OJ was set up and he didn't do it. Well, according to the Evergreens, and they could go into detail because Michael be in a deep trance state and he'd be totally out of it. And then you do an hour session and he'd wake up and immediately he'd remember something about the content, the topics. So you'd let him talk and he discusses, quote, dream imagery. So he would say stuff, well, I could see OJ, very jealous person. And he walks up and he would describe how he, pulled a knife on and all that. This is what Michael would see when you brought him out of trance, but you get the precise details during the trance. So very graphic details of all these cases. Basically in the Kennedy assassination, 5 people, J. Edgar Hoover, Nelson Rockefeller, not Allen Dulles or James Angleton. They didn't know. So it was Hoover. Oh yeah, Jimmy Hoffa, James Hoffa, Nelson Rockefeller, Hoover, a military guy, probably the famous guy who had those planes bombing Cuba in 1962. Can't remember his name. He's a legend. Remember?
Bomber LeMay, Curtis LeMay.
Yeah, I think that's it. It's him or the other guy. But yeah, I go with Curtis LeMay usually if I can't remember. And then a technician. And Nelson Rockefeller was the only one who knew all the people of the 5. Now, the other guys didn't know the other 4 or 3 or whatever. So at the end of my talking to, and I did a long series, many sessions over many years, they wouldn't start to tell me till 91 after a particular mafia guy had died. Then I was kind of safer knowing, or at least that's what the Evergreen said. So, and they knew I would broadcast it. So at the end of the final session, Hoover comes on. And I used to talk to dead people all the time through the Evergreens. And Hoover's there, and Michael Blake Reed said later, he was like a slug on a log. But he was so convinced he was right. He was against Catholics. He thought there was a Catholic conspiracy. So he didn't trust the Kennedys. And then when they were, he knew they killed Marilyn Monroe, Robert and Jack. So he felt justified in nailing them. That violated his conscience or whatever the hell values he had, that Kennedy deserved to be gotten rid of. So he got Hoff and them to do stuff. But he comes on and he says, Bob, I was betrayed. He still thought he was right, and whatever happened after, his reputation went down the drain. He felt he was still being betrayed, double-crossed by his fellow conspirators, which he thought was a justified cause. Isn't that interesting? I mean, just to have that happen. I mean, have you talked to anybody lately who could bring in Hoover and tell you stuff like that? I doubt it.
Yeah, I mean, I've been in certain channeling sessions. It's tough. I mean, it's still hearsay, but just in terms of the overall, so the overall.
Oh, here's the neat part.
Huh?
Lee Harvey Oswald, when Gerald Ford and them came out saying, well, we checked it out, he did not assassinate Kennedy, they stuck to the lone nut theory,
Sure.
Okay? They were partly right. Oswald was brought into the first attempt in Chicago and the second one down in Miami. One of them was called off, I think. But he knew, he thought that he was doing a good thing. He said he was instructed to shoot, but miss, okay? So he thought he was doing warning shots. So when he did Dallas, he accidentally hit Kennedy. He was trying not to hit him. And so he didn't kill Kennedy, but he was.
I don't know. That's hard to. That's really hard for me to believe that Oswald was up on the 6th floor with just I don't know. That's
no. Well, the Evergreens go into that. There were a lot of books were put out to confuse it. The ones like Mark Lane that seemed to reveal the mistakes of the Warren Commission, they weren't mistakes, but everybody believed Mark Lane because decentralizing media, people weren't following Big Brother anymore, so they wanted to.
Yeah, but Gerald Ford did move the entry point of the bullet to make it fit for Oswald's angle, but sure, go ahead.
Let me finish I said it wrong about Oswald. Oswald did kill Kennedy, but he wasn't intending to, and the Warren Commission understood that. So they say no, that didn't work. What am I trying to say here?
I still don't get how Oswald with one shot got 7 bullet wounds in Kennedy and Connolly. It just doesn't matter.
No, there were other shooters. But the Warren Commission guys, when they had to, as the church committee stuff and later things came out, like that movie, your father's movie, JFK, wasn't that made by your father?
Yes.
Yeah, the Evergreen said, Garrison was right. And that's what's bad about Adam Curtis's documentary. He plays Garrison as wrong and a conspiracy theorist. That's
why I can't even appreciate this nonsense that Curtis is putting out with some of his theories. Where again, you have to remember BBC is British intelligence historically, and I think it still plays a certain role connected to intelligence. As a lot of networks, a lot of journalists are working with intelligence agencies. People like Anderson Cooper. Very obvious one. But yes, so
let me clarify it's important to get, at least with the Evergreens, what they said on record. So definitely the other guys shot. There was another guy up in the another floor of the Texas deposit, just down the wing from Oswald. So Oswald shot, but he thought he was to miss, but he accidentally hit him, and he got him in the back, and the grassy knoll got him in the head. But they say Oswald's bullet was the more lethal one, the one that got him back here. Now, the Evergreens would describe this in minute detail, timing and everything. Might have been all made up, but they were really good on detail. So the Warren Commission said, could say Oswald did it because they knew he did do it. But they might have known that he didn't intend to do it.
The problem with this kind of stuff though is how do you know that these aren't just tricksters? A lot of times beings will manipulate information, they'll disseminate false information, right? That's why I'm asking, they never gave you an overarching picture of the dark side, because there's a lot of dark influence on this planet.
They did.
Tell me that.
Yeah, basically, the Evergreens were not moralistic. They celebrate the body more than other channelers who always said, you know, you got to go divine, you got to go to another dimension in your higher self. The Evergreen said the physical is very important. So they were different in that way. They were hedonistic, you could say. And they accepted the perversity of humans. They didn't get very judgmental, but they told me who did what and who killed who. But they were on the non-physical. So they didn't care about this. Now you could say, oh, okay, they're entities, they're amoral, but I did many things, good stuff with the Evergreens, and got good information from them. So I never thought that they had a dark side themselves. But yeah, they got me to relax about being moralistic about human behavior, about murdering in that, because if you accept that you live after death, then death ain't no big deal. And the Evergreens described how we reincarnated, not in the Hindu level, but that we came back.
Yeah.
And you know what? Here's what's neat. They said that often soldiers who got killed on the field in war, they die, and then they realize they're still alive, and they'd be pissed off that they died, and they'd plunge back in and reincarnate as soon as they could. And basically when you reincarnate, the moral part of it was you had to discuss your next life with people you're going to do when you're in the death plane. And then you'd reincarnate with that plan, that purpose. But if you didn't do that, and you had freedom, you'd plunge back in and reincarnate without a plan. So that might create a lot of crazy behavior because you didn't set it up. So knowing the broader, theories, if we don't believe the Evergreens, theories, you relax on the dark side about that as a category of humans and that we're controlled by it. Yes, we are, but in many societies, the Evergreens would describe many anthropological situations. And there was a tribe that anger was the way you act normally. Everybody was pissed off. That was the way you were a good citizen in the tribe, is by being angry all the time. So humans mutated, created all kinds of weird variations in their cultural makeup. Who are you looking at? Who are you laughing at? Who's on the side there?
It's my girlfriend is here. So yeah,
is she listening to me and laughing at what I'm saying?
No, actually, I'm just thinking. It's, to me, there's truth to that, but I actually have my reservations about what these entities really were, because there is I understand the nature of the reality that we're existing through, and I know that there's there is a necessity to the dark side, and the dark side does help in the sense of evolution. But there is a dark force that does feed on us and does utilize and does manipulate humanity. And I think it's just curious that they never really talked about that force. So I'm suspicious.
They told me that people killed each other and conspired. They had a conspiratorial. They knew that secrecy and conspiring was always happening and would explain it, but they didn't judge it. Well, okay. What about karma? Let's see. I once asked, who was the most evil person in history? Okay. Who is the greatest sinner? There was this great movie, The World's Greatest Sinner, that Zappa did music for back in '63. Jack Nicholson and those guys say it's their favorite movie. It was made by Tim Carey. He used to be in Kubrick movies, Tim Carey. Anyways, so on the theme, who's the world's greatest sinner? I said Hitler, or named a few, the greats, and they said, no. It was this general in Rome, say about 200 AD, who walked into a village and killed 3,000 people for no good reason. Women and children, just mowed them all down. And, they were pleading to stay alive. They weren't a big threat, but he killed them all. But the point is that he was the greatest because he had no forgiveness. This is what the Evergreens said. Now, this is a pretty lofty Aquarian notion. He didn't have any forgiveness. So when he died, he then reincarnated in situations that he didn't get forgiveness. He had a couple of lifetimes with that, quote, curse on him. So that was the kind of karma that the Air Marines were pointing out. It was a little more complicated, the karma thing. So I thought those kind of complications showed that these entities were thoughtful and brought in other complications. And I thought that had a good effect on me. It didn't make me so thinking there's a dark side and there's a light side. I'm not a dualistic in that sense. And so I accept my own evil damn fucking self, right? Okay.
There are degrees of evil in this world.
Yeah.
It's very
But
difficult
they
to
but they
fathom.
did.
It's very difficult to agree with that philosophy though, because karma is a bitch. When you incur with anger and hatred and suffering, and you instill it in others, and you lack empathy, there are sociopaths in this world, and there is possession in this world. So again, I'm very suspicious about their interpretation of a lot of things. But anyway,
Well,
I mean, look,
that's the
it's
case
interesting
with
to hear.
everything. Nobody ever agrees with anybody totally, you know.
And
That's our sovereign, that's your sovereign self.
of
The right
course,
to
of course,
not
and that's
be
the beauty of-
conditioned by anybody.
Yes,
So,
that's very much the beauty of the human experience, is this individual perspective that we are engaging with and experiencing and experimenting with. So yeah, it is a continuous exploration in consciousness.
yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think those are the major